Hello again. Today let's talk about the second industrial revolution, and I'm talking about the years roughly, let's say 1880, 1890, over several decades, let's say right on up to World War I, maybe a little beyond, but roughly in these decades, right? Big turning point in history. You might say, what is the second industrial revolution? Well, the first was what we've already discussed, which starts more or less in the 18th century, primarily in England, and then will spread out gradually, particularly Western Europe into Europe. The first industrial revolution, what are the big turning points there? Well, you may recall the textile revolution, the agricultural revolution, the ability to produce more food than ever, the introduction of widespread use of iron, not yet quite steel, high-grade steel like we'll see later on. The railroad, one of the big innovations which really has an impact on virtually everything else. The second industrial revolution is also going to have a number of turning points, and it really is going to bring in the world that we begin to understand much more because, well, it's the world, at least for me, of my grandparents, and to some extent even of my parents. My mother born in 1917. So what are the big changes that occur, and changes that sometimes appear to be quite little but aren't? Well, we have, I would say, the much greater integration of the world because of the second industrial revolution. Talking about transport, I'm talking about, of course, the further development of the railroads, but now the internal combustion engine, new kinds of engines. The internal combustion engine is going to give us the automobile. The automobile is going to be a spur for all kinds of collateral industries, everything from leather to rubber, to engines and engine technology, to the need for production of oil, petroleum, and so on and so forth. This is an era when you might say science and technology converge maybe more than ever. This is an era when science really comes into its own in terms of being able to produce new products. You have an explosion in chemistry. In fact, one of my professors in the past at Washington University, his father was Max von Laue, who actually won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Chemistry now really comes into its own as not only as a curriculum, but as a science. And of course, chemistry means all kinds of new products which have to do with healthcare, which have to do with transport, antiseptics, anesthetics, and of course what we all used to take anyway for headaches, the aspirin. All these new products, all of these new ways of sort of, let's just say, killing germs, antiseptics, etc. So chemistry really comes into its own now. Steel. Once you have the mass production of steel, once you're able to get the impurities, for example, sulfur, out of the production of steel, then this takes off. And of course, steel is going to fuel, or at least it will be there for a number of industries, the automobile, new engine technologies, once again the railroad, of course, the expansion of the railroad and steel really go hand in hand. So you have a massive transformation in everything from chemistry to electronics to the production of electricity. My first house was actually outfitted for gas lights. Although they were just going out of use. My house was built sometime around 1900 up in Iowa. And of course electricity is just coming in, the electric grid, the electrification of homes. And of course electricity is going to change virtually everything. You can now have a production schedule that goes 24 hours. You can now read in your home at 10 o'clock at night. I know that most of you are still doing that because of electricity, right? If I were to ask you what you think is the greatest invention of all, well, some economists and economic historians have said this. What is the greatest invention of them all? And some have said the light bulb. Doesn't sound like high tech, does it? Nevertheless, it is electrification, the light bulb, and of course that can be used for everything, also from heating, for you name it, right? So electrification is very big. When you add up also the transportation, the transport revolution, the steamship, for example, which was already around in the 1860s, 1870s, right? The steamship, the rail, the automobile, trucks, then what you have more and more and more is the integration of the world, for good or for bad. And of course that means international trade becomes, is going to expand geometrically. Just because of that, just because you can now cut the distance or the time to go across the Atlantic. It used to be months when we started out in the 16th century. It's going to be a matter of days by the end of the 19th century. So we're talking about the integration of the world because of the second industrial revolution. Another thing which contributes to it, of course, is the unification of some countries which had not been unified before. The unification of Germany actually allows Germany to become a world power. It's because of political unification, but political unification goes along with economic unification, and that is what allows Germany to sort of now propel its universities right into the top rank of all universities, and that's where a lot of the research is being done, and that's where Germany is going to excel. And the result, of course, is that Germany is going to be able to compete in a number of different areas with Britain. So the Industrial Revolution, the result perhaps causes to some extent unification, but it also leads to greater competition between a number of the Western powers. Result? Well, some would say one of the results is war, World War I. Competition particularly between Britain and Germany, which gets out of hand a bit. Many other causes, that's true, but nevertheless economic competition is right up there as well. The German Navy becomes very powerful, and it becomes the chief competitor really with Britain, with the British Navy, which had always been the dominant navy in the world. Other things that happen, of course, and we'll talk later about a separate topic, but imperialism, because once you have the integration of the world, once you have these powerhouses, economic powerhouses and political powerhouses, including the United States already by getting to emerge around 1900, then they are economically dominant and they can impose their own will, you might say, on trade relationships, and of course colonial relationships will exist also still. So the Industrial Revolution essentially makes the first and the second together really makes the West dominant, because that's where the Industrial Revolution is occurring, and the West now has the technology to allow it to dominate world trade, to impose its will in imperial relationships, and so on and so forth. And we're going to see that. You just take a look at the economic statistics and you'll see it quite clearly. The Industrial Revolution also has a tremendous impact, of course, on domestic politics in a number of countries. And I'll just illustrate this with Great Britain. One of the things the Industrial Revolution does is it begins to give us a middle class, such as had not existed before. These are the commercial travelers, or the salespeople, these are the clerks, these are the professionals, the lawyers and doctors, these are the journalists, these are the large populations simply of clerical people who do the sort of the tabulations, I guess you could say, for the new Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution. The emergence of the department store, which we all love now, and where now many of them we find in malls, but the emergence of the department store, these giant department stores, where all the goods of the world are now going to appear, also is on the scene, also employing many people, and also converting many of us into consumers. So this great consumer age is also going to spread, because now you have cheap textiles, you have cheap textile clothing, you have cheap goods coming in because of the ability to mass produce. Mass production, another invention that comes along with the Second Industrial Revolution. Henry Ford, Highland Park, Detroit, Michigan, that's where all of that starts. And that's going to allow particularly Western countries to produce in a way that they had never anticipated before. To go back to the domestic political structure, so you got the middle class, we also have the working class, the industrial working class, which is actually going to clash with the earlier, more skilled working class. The industrial working class, however, is going to give us large working classes, and this is the class Marx had anticipated, arriving a little bit later than he thought, arriving actually after his death in 1883. But in any case, there it is. And as in Britain, to go back to Britain, as that industrial class, as that working class begins to expand, its numbers are much larger, and it begins to be a political force. The formation of unions, which by the way in Britain are not legalized until the 1870s, when William Gladstone is the Prime Minister in England. So the legalization of trade unions, the emergence of a working class, that's going to lead directly in 1899 to the London, forget what the original the title was, but it's essentially the Labour Party. And the Labour Party is called that in 1900. The Labour Party emerges, and the working class in England, Britain, has its own political party, very important for the development of other things, such as the emergence of a welfare state, another result of industrialization. So the state getting involved in helping to promote health care, pensions, unemployment compensation, all of those kinds of things which come into being when you have a combination of Labor and Liberal Party coming together in 1906, and they begin to promote that kind of thing. There's your beginnings, at least in Britain, of social democracy, which will come along, especially later on. So all of these are factors in the building out the second industrial revolution, enormous consequences. If I had to pick one consequence which was perhaps greater than any other, I might say, well, if you want to understand why does Europe become the dominant continent rather than Asia, there's no question that this second industrial revolution is one of the answers. So Europe becomes dominant. It's already somewhat dominant because it had led the commercial revolution, the first industrial revolution, but the second revolution kind of seals this bargain, so to speak. And Europe becomes the dominant continent. That's not necessarily going to remain for a very long time, is it? We're watching now daily as China gets stronger and we begin to have the possibility of a trade conflict, trade war, or whatever. Anyway, Europe, very much dominant because of the second industrial revolution. World War I might challenge that. World War II might challenge that even further. But there you have it, the second industrial revolution.